is a flute sonata written by Richard Allen White, who is a composer, whose story I think will appeal to listeners who, like many of us, either are late bloomers creatively, or people who have, a creative side that they kind of have or still are putting on hold, just so they can make a living in New York and beyond, the day job, support the family or whatever. Richard Allen White's 82 years old. He's living in Brooklyn Heights. He was trained as a composer, but he worked most of his professional life wearing a badge for New York City Probation Department and as a security guard for Columbia University, as well as Daniel Webster College in New Hampshire, where he was born and raised originally. So, Richard, thanks for coming on this morning.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, tell listeners what we were listening to. Just a pitifully short snippet of that flute work. What was that, and when did you write that?
That was the first movement of the flute sonata that I wrote for my daughter Rebecca, who was playing the flute.
Right, Rebecca White, who was playing the flute. Rebecca White is a journalist and worked for the Times for years, and she's a trained classical flautist, and she was playing on that number. And tell us, Richard.
It was a learning experience for me because I had to do some rewriting for my daughter. Then I learned that you have to feature the star performer, what she is.
Yeah, right. You have to write for the instrument and the instrumentalist, right? Yeah.
You can't just write for the instrument and just put the voice part as if putting clothes on a clothesline. You have to recreate the lead voice with its separate expressive identities.
Yeah.
And she didn't tell me in so many words, but she did say the magic word, rewrite it.
Right. Only those closest to you. So would you actually test out parts and she'd play them and then you'd revise and that type of thing?
Oh, yes. I would be working on the flute sonata, and she would come down and to my apartment. She'd play it. I would play the piano part. And what she said is very apropos to, especially, say you got somebody like a soprano or a bass, they want you to feature them.
Right.
And I'm not beyond rewriting. We did a session one time presenting a disc, and the baritone says, "Well, do this. It's much easier to sing." So I smiled and said, "Okay, you can do it your way."
Yeah. Now you were trained as a composer early in life, but as a young man and who married and had a family living in New York, you found that having a master's in composition from Columbia University, no less, was no meal ticket in New York. You didn't just sit down and compose and the money came magically coming in. You had to go get a day job, and you found a job many places, but among those places, you found it with the New York City Probation Department as an investigator, and then later as a security guard at universities, including Columbia, for 10 years. Now, how does one remain a composer in life and have to work those jobs?
Well, you do. It's naturally. As I walk around, I come across this. I'm percolating these themes. And I can think of specific examples where I walk into a room, there'd be a piano, and I would play some music, and I would use it. But the main key is, no matter what your percolating may amount to, you have to coalesce your material in the studio that is your own. So I was able to do those jobs without having a hangover that took me into my private life.
Mm-hmm. You mean that the jobs were not intellectually draining type of jobs where you had to bring your work home with you? In other words, it was punch in, punch out, and then you could come home and whatever ideas percolated while you were walking the beat or whatever you were doing, working with defendants or whatever, you could come home and during the, you work night hours, I assume, on these jobs with the security and stuff, and you could come home and work out on the piano different ideas that had been running through your head, right?
Yes, but you can't tune out. I had to respond to emergency situations.
Yeah.
I had to. I had experiences like putting handcuffs on people, chasing people through Riverside Park. Really, I was exposed.
Right.
You were on the edge of some kind of action that could happen at any time.
So, like, you came home from a shift that had a lot of action, and then you'd write like a great scherzo, right? Like, it would be more agitated type of music, I assume. Did it work like that?
I I remember walking down Amsterdam Avenue and saying, gee, I'm the only one who knows this theme, what's going on. And I could thank that to the kind of privacy that I had while I was working on the job. Nobody bothered me aside from the sergeant who would ask me to do specific duties.
The crackle of the police radio. When you mentioned that, working these shifts, especially, I could, in my mind's eye, I form my own image of you, working these shifts and having to do building patrols and campus patrols, especially at Columbia and other places where you mentioned that once in a while you don't, in a music building, for example, you sat down at a student piano one time or teaching piano, whatever it was, and you kind of hacked out a theme that you had been in your head. And a custodian who was cleaning up at night, complimented the theme, and you went home and wrote it, and that wound up in this opera now that has become accepted and is being produced in October, right?
Yeah, that was a great feeling for me because Verdi wrote an opera called Nabucco, and there's a great scene called Va Pensiero, and the workmen were working on the building, and when the chorus started singing Va Pensiero, the workmen stopped, and they gave him a nice hand afterwards. So. I appreciated that comment from this guy.
Yeah, so I didn't even know he was a tradition of these things coming. Creativity. It's something that you can't turn on and off whenever you want to, 9 to 5, right? It comes during your day, during your week, your month, your year of your life, and you have to, and you hopefully can harness it and get it down and write it down and develop it, right? And this type of thing.
I missed the very beginning of what you said.
I'm saying, you as a composer, you can't just do 9 to 5. I mean, these ideas come to you when they come to you, right?
Yeah, well, lots of times I sit there and I can look at the stack of music and I say, well, I did all that. I must be able to come up with something.
Right. Yeah. Huh. So let's talk for a second, just so people know part of the immediate reason why we're speaking is that you had this opera, which is called Hester, based on the Scarlet Letter by Hawthorne. It wound up being a 900-page opera, 3-hour-long work, and it's been accepted by the Center for Contemporary Opera in New York for a performance on October 12th at the National Opera Center Recital Hall in Manhattan. And this is your big public debut, the opera that you wrote over decades of your life, even wearing a badge and all these other things. It's finished. It's been accepted. It's being performed by a very professional, excellent production of Hester, right? I mean, you must be pleased with that, right?
Yes, I am. I must say, though, the 900 pages was the orchestral score. Mm-hmm. The piano vocal score is a little shorter. But, it's a great opportunity for me. And I'm frankly impressed by they're taking on a project this large.
Yeah, right. I mean, did you ever think, hitting your 80s that, this opus that you spent so many years on, so much of your energy on creative output, did you ever think that maybe this thing will never be heard,
I have experienced bits of anxiety. In fact, it's one of the reasons I put this stuff together. Is that when I was living in Milford, New Hampshire, I go to the library every day. And I get all this information of what operas were being done in the New York area, who produced them, who the conductor was, who the singer was. And every day I would pull up all this information. At the end of 2 or 3 years, I had this big stack of data, which I dumped on my daughter. And she promptly called it Operation Opera. And she was able to contact somehow Jim Schaefer in the Center for Contemporary Opera.
Right. So that's part of how this came about. Your daughter Rebecca, took it upon herself to try to find a venue, try to find a company that would produce it. And producing an opera is no small feat, yes. I would think.
Yes, but it did touch upon a nerve that, at the time, I was going into my 70s. How long is this? Are the wheels going to keep on turning? So I realized that also, having lived in New York for about 35 years, and I've done some acting, and I know where you can get out there and reach the public. If you want to be a free artist, you have to confront the free market, and you have to present yourself with your material.
Yeah, right. Huh. Speaking of, you said you were an actor. I mean, that was one of the other things that you did creatively. I mean, you studied at HB Studios with the great teacher Uta Hagen, right? What was that like? Did you were you in there with James Dean and all these people we hear about? Maybe I have the wrong studio and all these legendary actors that came out of that.
No, I don't remember.
But there were some notables, right?
Yes, I remember I did I've seen, I can't remember the names, but there was a great teacher, Stephen Strimpel and Alice Spivak, as well as Uta Hagen. It's really fun because at first, before she wrote her book, Respect for Acting, Uta Hagen would be on stage. She made this presentation that went on for an hour or so, and then she finally wrote this book. But she was a great insight, shall we say, into theater. I finally realized, I was very skeptical at first, but I realized there was the literature and a body of knowledge in the field of acting.
Right. Hey, by the way, did being an actor and that training affect you as a composer? In other words, did you do more singing pieces as a composer because of that? Were you aware of what what performers were and were not capable of? I don't know. Did any overlap there with the music?
Well, actually, I took a lot of voice lessons too, and from great teachers. But there was one big overlap between my acting experience and my composing experience, and that is, I knew the words before I wrote the music. In fact, when I was acting with my scene partners, they used to drive them crazy. And I remember one girl, she said, "I was at the original performance," where I was just playing, reading the words as they were. And then, as I got to know what the words were, then more theatrical, shall we say, technical choices would present themselves.
Yeah.
I always remember there's a great interview with anyway, that's the. In other words, I write the words before I write the music.
Right. So yeah, you were a stickler for the lines, and so with Hester, the opera, you started writing your libretto, your lyrics first, right? And then you started kind of like musicifying those lines, right? Putting them to melodies.
Yeah, I wrote the libretto before I wrote the words.
Yeah.
Music.
Right, and not all people who write operas, composers write their own librettos. In fact, most have librettists, right? And they use.
I can only think of very few. Wagner. I knew this guy. I used to study singing Lieder. And I go to his apartment, and this guy would smoke a cigarette. He was from Germany, and he would correct my pronunciation of German. He used to tell me that he and his German buddies, they take a Wagner libretto and they go out and they be in hysterics because they're so, if you look at them objectively, they're so, I don't know, unworldly. But we must remember there was a composer by the name of Boito, B-O-I-T-O, and he was very influenced in theater. He knew Dusa, the great actress. And so he wrote his own librettos and his own opera, Mephistopheles. He also wrote librettos for Verdi, for Falstaff and Othello.
Yeah. Okay, I'm Corey Kilgannon and WBAI Talk Mac, Talk Back here on Wednesday morning, and we're talking with Richard Allen White, the composer who wore a badge for most of his professional life and wrote opera, let's say, on the side, after work, before work, whenever he could be home with his piano. And that resulted in an opera called Hester, based on the Scarlet Letter. And at 82 years old, Richard got this opera accepted by the Center for Contemporary Opera in Manhattan. And on October 12th, the opera will be performed at the National Opera Center Recital Hall in Manhattan. And it's Mr. White's debut as a composer. One thing I wanted to mention on the, shall we say, law enforcement side of things. You worked in the 70s at a number of places in New York City, and including the 42nd Street, the 42nd Precinct in the South Bronx, and in courthouses in Lower Manhattan. And you eventually left the probation job because it became a little bit too, let's say, intense with paperwork and working with defendants, and it kind of interfered with your musical thought and creativity, right?
Yes. Actually, I worked in criminal court. Then they closed my outfit down. And finally, I quit the job. I realized, asked myself, the big thing is ask yourself the question. What is the question? Don't think about what is the answer kind of stuff. What is the question that you have? And the question I put to myself was, were you once a musician? Did you have this training as a composer? And what's happening to that? And although I came up with an answer, I take these long walks. I leave 60 Lafayette Street. I walk down to Canal Street, take a right up Broadway. I walk to about 72nd Street on Broadway. Then I get tired and I take the bus. You can't focus too much on the answer. The first thing is get the question. What are these? What was happening with my life? So eventually I quit the job.
Yeah.
And that means quitting my pension. I get a decent pension from Columbia University, but mainly it's because, well, it's a nice little pension, but it's from Columbia University as a security officer.
Yeah. Huh. By the way, one thing, you studied with Hall Overton, the composer, who had kind of a classical side and a jazz side. A lot of people call him third stream because he had this kind of almost classical approach to jazz, or unconventional jazz sensibility. And one of the things he became famous for was this jazz loft in Midtown on 6th Avenue, where, Stan Getz, Thelonious Monk, a lot of jazz greats would come and jam at night and kind of workshop tunes and theory and that type of stuff. You studied with Hall Overton during the daytime, and you played on the same piano that guys like Monk would be playing on at night. What was it like studying with Hall Overton, and how conscious were you of the whole jazz scene that was happening, like on the night side of that? When you were probably a security guard.
Well, I became conscious. For instance, one time I arrived a little late in the afternoon and whatnot. As I'm walking up the stairs, I hear this jazz music coming from this clarinet player at the piano of Hall Overton. So the two of them are playing jazz, and this jazz man playing his clarinet. So when I went inside, the clarinet player was taking apart his instrument, putting it into his case, and he says, "I'm beginning to feel like an intellectual." And so Overton, he had a great way of reaching many different types of composers. And believe me, if somebody with Thelonious Monk, with his talent and genuine ability, you have to gain his trust and respect. And Overton had that. Plus Zoot Sims. And we must remember the photographer, who was Eugene Smith, who was also in the same building. He was shooting everything. And nobody really knew he was there, except Zoot Sims used to refer to this guy Smith as Lamont Cranston, alias the Shadow, because
because the Shadow knows he would be popping out or camouflaged and shooting pictures, which became famous later because that whole scene at the jazz loft became so well documented photographically by him, Eugene Smith. And I guess it was Zoot Sims, not Stan Getz, right? Getz wasn't part of that scene.
As I recall, I'm just recalling from reading, there was an article in Times concerning this book, Jazz Loft, and I'm pretty sure it was Zoot Sims.
Right.
Stan Getz was more, I don't think it was Stan Getz.
Yeah. So the intellectual thing, I guess Hall Overton had a pretty intense approach, music theory-wise, to a lot of, not only to the stuff he was teaching you, but to the jazz as well, right?
He did. And, of course, he wrote the book there was a concert on Town Hall put together for...
he orchestrated Monk's famous, 64 or whatever, concert at Town Hall, right?
Yes.
Right, for a big band.
Yes. But, he had this quality of knowledge, but, some musicians, they can really put it to you if things are right or not right. But I remember he asked me to take a look at the Roy Harris Symphony No. 3. So I made a presentation of this Roy Harris Symphony No. 3, and I showed up at the Loft building, and Hall Overton looked at it, and he said, "Gee, I asked you to do something, but I didn't expect anything like this." But the way he spoke it was so person to person, so encouraging that I was grateful to him.
Yeah. Huh. So one thing that struck me that I included in the article is that you need your piano tuned. I mean, you haven't got this piano. You're working on this upright. You're a composer of opera, and you're working on this upright that you've had since passed down from your mother, and the thing is out of tune now. What is it going to take to get this piano tuned? We had a couple readers of the Times who actually emailed in, who offering maybe, is this going to happen? Offering to to pay for it or whatever if you were you didn't have the cash available to tune your piano, even though you're turning out operas here.
Yes.
Did Rossini have this problem? People like that?
Rossini, he was a little lazy. He did a lot of his composing lying in bed. I'm just facetious. So Beethoven claims that he worked with a tuned piano. No, I'm sure somehow they would scratch the cash to get their piano tuned.
Yeah. That's amazing. You know what? It's so. You mentioned befriending a lot of artists during the '50s and that time. A lot of painters. Bill Rice. You have a painting of Bill Rice yourself, and that Bill gave to you, and hanging out at places like the Cedar Tavern where Jackson Pollock, William de Kooning, would drink. Hanging around with that crowd, that must have been really something. But it's. They kind of had this, kind of chaotic approach to their art. Some of them, it's a spontaneous approach. I know. Did that rub off on you at all? How methodical were you with your work?
I did go to the Cedar Tavern quite a bit, and then maybe on the way to the Cedar Tavern, I'd stop off at Bradley's, and then for a little variety, I went to the Sheridan Square where there was the Lion's Den and the Five Spot. But I think there was a guy named I can't remember. It was Ed Newman and Bill Rice was a big influence. He was a great friend of mine, and he was from Vermont. And because I'm from New Hampshire, should we play this kind of, well, how you doing? Well, I'm not talking, it's like a couple of hillbillies from New England. But he gave me this painting, which is on my wall. He was in 13 East 3rd for a long time, and he had a studio in Great Jones Place, which is sort of off the Broadway in Bowery.
Yeah. Okay, so you're looking forward to this, to your opera to the production of your opera on the 12th, right, in Manhattan, and it's again
October 12th.
Yeah, the Center for Contemporary Opera, and let me see. I should give some of the information. I know they've done well with the ticket sales, right? I mean, but maybe if their tickets are still available, the Center for Contemporary Opera has a website, and they do sell, and you can find your way to tickets from that site. And you have your site too, Richard Allen White. I'll find the exact site to give to listeners.
As I understand, though, that October 12th has been sold out.
Is that right?
So also they're working on having another performance date, but that's not certain yet. But for the date for October 12th has been sold out. I just hope they like the music. That's
right.
all.
Yeah. All right. So that's, by the way, the website is centerforcontemporaryopera.org, and you can find information about Hester, a new opera at age 82 for Richard Allen White. So it's great that you're getting your due, Better late than never, as they say, right?
I forget who said that.
To coin a phrase. Okay, I wonder if maybe we could hear a little more of the piano sonata. Would that be hard to pull off?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, I appreciate you coming on, and I hope you do get your piano tuned. Maybe we'll call the piano tuner and talk to him about. Yeah. All right. Okay. So, Richard, best of luck with the production. I hope it goes well, and hope people love it. And it's great that you're finally getting your due with this thing. Many years in the making, right?
Thank you for having me on. This is a great show.
Yeah, okay. Thanks a lot for being on. And that was Richard Allen White, composer, 82 years of age, lives in Brooklyn. Again, many decades in the making. He finally came up with an opera called Hester, and it's being produced October 12th by the Center for Contemporary Opera in Manhattan.